There comes a moment in every man's life when he must choose between who he was and who he needs to become. For the people of Skelgard Valley, that moment arrived with the cruelest winter in living memory. The sea froze solid, trapping their food beneath ice. Village stores ran empty. The elders spoke harsh truth, only the strong would survive. Everyone looked to Gunnar Bjornbane, the chieftain's giant son, a man whose hands had only known war. But instead of taking up his sword, Gunnar did something no one expected. He built ovens from river stones and fed his starving people with his own bread. Day after day, he cooked for them, shared with them, kept them alive through the darkest months. But how does a warrior become a protector? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Skelgard Valley had always been a place where the land tested men's souls. Nestled between towering cliffs that caught the morning light like ancient shields, the village sprawled along the shoreline, where the Ironwater River met the northern sea. Stone houses with thick timber roofs dotted the landscape, their walls weathered by countless storms, their hearths glowing warm against the perpetual bite of Arctic wind. This was not a soft place. It was a place that forged hard people. Gunnar Bjornbane stood nearly 7 feet tall, his shoulders broad enough to cast shadows over 2 grown men. His hands, scarred from 100 battles, could crush a man's skull or wield a war hammer with devastating precision. The village children scattered when he walked the stone paths between houses, not from cruelty, but from the weight of his presence. When Gunnar moved, the very air seemed to acknowledge his power. Yet for all his fearsome reputation, the people of Skelgard felt safer knowing he walked among them. Gunnar had earned his name, Bjornbane the Bear Killer, in the distant mountains where he'd faced down a massive brown bear with nothing but his blade and his fury. The beast's claws had left 3 deep scars across his chest, marks he wore like a badge of honor. But it was not the only creature that had fallen to his strength. In the great hall where the chieftain held court, tapestries told stories of Gunnar's conquests. Battles against rival clans, raids on southern settlements, victories that brought gold and glory back to Skelgard. His war hammer, forged from iron taken from a defeated enemy's sword, hung on the wall beside his father's throne. The weapon was massive, requiring both hands for most men to lift, yet Gunnar wielded it like a willow branch. His father, Thorwald the Grey, had ruled Skelgard for 30 winters. Once a giant himself, age had bent his frame and silvered his beard, but his mind remained sharp as any blade. Thorwald watched his son with a mixture of pride and concern. Pride for the warrior Gunnar had become, concern for the man he had not yet learned to be. A leader must know when to strike and when to shield, Thorwald often said, stroking his long beard as he gazed out at the village from the great hall's windows. Your strength has won us many battles, my son. But battles are not the only storms a people must weather. The village itself housed nearly 200 souls. There was Astrid the Wise, an elder woman whose memory held 3 generations of Skelgard's history. Her weathered hands could weave stories as skillfully as they wove wool, and the children gathered around her fire every evening to hear tales of heroes and gods. Her husband had died in a sea storm 20 years past, but she had never remarried, claiming that Skelgard's stories needed her full attention. Eric Ironforge worked the village smithy, his massive arms pumping the bellows that kept the forge fires burning bright. His skill with metal was legendary throughout the northern settlements. When warriors needed weapons that would not break in battle, they came to Eric. When farmers needed tools that could cut through frozen earth, they sought his craft. His wife, Helga, managed the grain stores with an efficiency that bordered on divine blessing. There was Olaf, the fisherman, whose boats had brought in the largest catches for 15 seasons running. His sons, Bjorn and Magnus, had learned their father's trade well, and their nets often returned heavy with silver-scaled bounty. Olaf's wife, Freydis, tended the villagers sick and injured with herbs and healing songs passed down from her grandmother. Young Sigrid Moonhair helped her father tend the village's small herd of goats and sheep. Her hair caught sunlight like spun silver, and her laugh could lighten even the darkest winter day. She was 22 summers old, unmarried, despite several offers from neighboring settlements. The village women whispered that she was waiting for someone worthy of her spirit, though none dared guess who that might be. These were Gunnar's people, though he often felt like a stranger among them. While they worked their trades, raised their families, and built their lives around the rhythms of seasons and tides, Gunnar's world revolved around conflict and conquest. He could read the signs of approaching enemies in distant smoke, could plan battle strategies that turned certain defeat into glorious victory, could inspire men to fight beyond their limits. But when the evening fires burned low and families gathered to share quiet conversations, Gunnar often found himself alone. The great hall where he lived with his father felt more like a monument to war than a home. Weapons lined the walls, battle banners hung from the rafters. Every piece of furniture, every decoration, every treasure spoke of violence overcome and enemies defeated. It was a place that celebrated the taking of life, not the nurturing of it. The chieftain's iron torque, a thick band of twisted metal that marked his father's authority, rested on a pedestal near the throne. Someday that torque would pass to Gunnar. Someday he would be responsible not just for leading raids and winning battles, but for guiding the daily lives of every soul in Skelgard. The thought sat heavy in his chest like an undigested meal. Gunnar understood war. He understood strategy and strength and the clean mathematics of violence. But he did not understand how to comfort a crying child, or settle a dispute between neighbors, or help an old man tend his garden. These quieter challenges seemed more mysterious to him than any enemy army. As autumn deepened into winter, signs of trouble began to whisper through the valley. The winds carried a different scent, sharp and bitter with the promise of unusual cold. Haze formed earlier than usual on the edges of streams. The goats and sheep huddled closer together in their pens, their breath visible in clouds that should not have appeared for another month. Olaf returned from fishing expeditions with increasingly worried expressions. The water temperature was dropping faster than he had ever seen. Fish were moving to deeper waters, away from the coastal shallows where his nets could reach them. The seabirds that usually followed his boats had disappeared entirely. Following the fish to warmer southern waters, Astrid the Wise spent long hours studying the sky, reading omens in the movement of clouds and the color of sunsets. Her weather predictions had guided Skelgard through countless seasons, and her growing concern infected the entire village like a slow-spreading fever. The old stories speak of winters that came like wolves, she told the gathered elders one evening. Winters that devoured everything in their path. This feels like the beginning of such a time. In the grain stores, Helga Ironforge counted and recounted their supplies with increasing anxiety. The harvest had been adequate, not abundant. If winter lasted longer than usual, if the fishing remained poor, if the hunting became impossible due to extreme cold, the reserves would not carry them through to spring. Thorwald the Grey called council meetings with increasing frequency, gathering the village's wisest heads to discuss preparations and contingencies. But for all their wisdom, for all their experience, they were planning for a normal winter. None of them had lived through the kind of cold that Astrid's bones told her was coming. Gunnar attended these meetings but contributed little to the discussions. His expertise lay in external threats, in human enemies who could be fought and defeated. The approaching winter was a different kind of adversary, one that could not be intimidated or outmaneuvered or crushed beneath a warhammer's weight. Yet something stirred within him as he listened to the growing fears of his people. When he watched Sigrid helping her elderly neighbors prepare their homes for cold, when he saw Eric working extra hours to ensure every family had adequate tools, when he observed Astrid sharing her stored remedies with those who might need them, Gunnar felt an unfamiliar sensation. It was not the battle hunger that usually drove him. It was not the desire for glory or conquest that had shaped his youth. It was something quieter, deeper, more complex. For the first time in his life, Gunnar Bjornbane found himself wanting to protect rather than destroy, to build rather than break, to nurture rather than conquer. He did not yet understand what this feeling meant or where it might lead him. But as the first snow began to fall and the village prepared for what might be their greatest trial, Gunnar began to sense that his true test was approaching. Not a test of his strength in battle, but a test of his strength in something far more difficult, the test of learning to care for others more than himself. The morning Gunnar woke to absolute silence. He knew their world had changed forever. No waves crashed against the shore. No seabirds called from the cliffs. Even the wind had stilled, as if the earth itself held its breath. When he pushed open the great hall's heavy wooden doors, the sight that greeted him defied belief. The sea had turned to stone. From the village shore to the distant horizon, ice stretched unbroken and gleaming under the pale winter sun. Not the thin ice that formed during normal cold snaps, ice that boats could break through with effort. This was thick, solid, the kind of ice that would take months to thaw even if spring came early. Gunnar strode down to the water's edge, his boots crunching through snow that had fallen silently in the night. Where waves should have lapped against the rocky beach, a wall of ice rose nearly to his waist. He drew his knife and struck the surface with the pommel. The blade rang like a bell, but the ice showed not even a scratch. Behind him, other villagers emerged from their homes. Children who had run down to play by the water stopped short, their laughter dying in their throats. Women clutched their cloaks tighter, not just against the cold, but against the implications of what they saw. Men stood in stunned silence, understanding immediately what this meant for their survival. Olaf the fisherman arrived at the shore, carrying his nets, as he had every morning for 30 years. When he saw the ice, the nets slipped from his hands and fell into the snow. His face went grey as winter stone. "The fish," he whispered. All the fish. Trapped beneath, the village's primary food source, the silver bounty that filled their nets and smokehouse, now lay unreachable beneath a barrier thicker than castle walls. In normal times, fishing provided more than half their winter sustenance. Without it, their stored grain and preserved meat would have to stretch far beyond what any reasonable planning had prepared for. Word spread through Skelgard like wildfire. Families rushed to their own food stores, counting sacks of grain, wheels of cheese, barrels of salted meat. The calculations were grim. Even with careful rationing, their supplies would last perhaps 2 months. If this ice held until the normal spring thaw, they faced at least 4 months of winter. Astrid the Wise gathered the village children around her, not for stories this time, but for a harsh lesson in survival arithmetic. With gentle words that carried terrible weight, she explained how much each person could eat each day to make their food last. The portions she described would keep them alive, but barely. In the great hall, Thorwald the Grey convened an emergency council. The village's leaders sat around the massive oak table, their faces reflecting the gravity of their situation. Helga Ironforge had brought her ledgers, recording every ounce of grain, every preserved fish, every root vegetable stored in the village cellars. "We can reduce daily rations by half," she reported, her usually steady voice trembling. "That might carry us through to spring." "Might. Half rations will weaken us," Eric Ironforge countered. "Weak people die in cold. Die from sickness, die from accidents, die from losing the will to keep fighting." Olaf stared out the window toward the frozen sea. "I've never seen ice like this, never heard of ice like this. My grandfather told stories of bad winters, but nothing like this. The old tales speak of such times," Astrid said quietly. "Winters that lasted years, winters that emptied entire settlements. We always thought they were just stories." The elders debated through the morning, but every path they explored led to the same dark conclusion. Some would not survive. The question was not whether people would die, but how many, and whether enough would live to rebuild come spring. Gunnar listened to these discussions with growing agitation. These were good people, wise people, but they spoke of death with the same calm acceptance they might discuss bad weather, as if losing neighbors and friends was simply another challenge to endure. "We could hunt," he suggested during a brief pause in the conversation. Old Hakon, the village's most experienced hunter, shook his grizzled head. In cold this severe, the deer have moved south or gone deep into the mountain caves. The rabbits burrow too deep to find. Even if we found game, we'd burn more energy hunting than the meat would provide. Then we take what we need, Gunnar said, his voice hardening. Other settlements have stores. We have weapons. We have strength. The silence that followed his words felt as cold as the ice outside. Thorwald the Grey studied his son with eyes that held both understanding and disappointment. And what happens when their stores run empty? Astrid asked gently. Do we raid again? And again. How many villages must starve so that Skelgard might live? Survival requires hard choices, Gunnar replied. But even as he spoke the words, they felt hollow in his mouth. Yes, his father said quietly. But the hardest choice of all is how we survive. Whether we remain human in the process. That afternoon, Gunnar attempted to prove his point by leading a hunting expedition into the hills above the valley. He took 5 of the village's strongest men, all experienced in tracking and killing. They carried the best weapons, wore the warmest furs, and followed every trail and sign they could find. They found nothing. The cold was so intense that their breath froze before it could fully leave their lungs. Snow crunched underfoot with a sound like breaking bones. Even the hardiest evergreens seemed to shrink into themselves, their branches heavy with ice. After 6 hours of searching, they discovered a rabbit warren that should have held dozens of animals. The burrows were empty, abandoned for deeper shelters or warmer territories. They found deer tracks that led to the edge of a cliff, where the animals had apparently leaped to their deaths rather than face the impossible cold. By evening, the hunting party returned to Skelgard, empty-handed and half-frozen. Gunnar's fingers were numb despite his thick gloves. His feet had lost feeling entirely. Worst of all, he had learned that his father was right. This winter would not be conquered through strength or violence. That night, Thorwald the Grey took to his bed with a fever. The strain of leadership, combined with the bitter cold and the weight of their situation, had finally broken through his formidable constitution. As Gunnar sat beside his father's bed, applying cold cloths to his burning forehead, the old chieftain spoke in fragments. The fishing nets, Thorwald whispered. In the storage shed. Your mother's nets. She always said they were different, special. Gunnar found the nets his father mentioned, stored in a corner of the village's largest storage building. They were older than the others, woven from different fiber, marked with symbols he did not recognize. When he lifted them, they felt strangely warm in his hands, despite the freezing air. Freydis, the village healer, examined Thorwald through the night while Gunnar stood vigil. Her diagnosis was what everyone feared but none wanted to voice. The chieftain was dying, not from any wound or disease that could be treated, but from the simple fact that his old body could not fight both the cold and the weight of watching his people face starvation. As dawn broke over the frozen valley, Gunnar stood at his father's bedside and felt something break inside him. Not his strength or his courage, but something harder to name. The part of him that believed every problem could be solved with enough force, enough determination, enough willingness to take from others. Looking down at his massive hands, hands that had killed so many enemies, hands that had taken so much, Gunnar finally understood what his father had been trying to teach him all these years. True strength was not about what you could take or destroy. True strength was about what you could give and build. And if Skelgard was going to survive this winter, it would not be because Gunnar Bjornbane was the finest warrior in the northern lands. It would be because he learned to become something else entirely. The idea came to Gunnar not as revelation, but as memory. 3 days after the sea froze and his father fell ill, Gunnar found himself walking the frozen riverbank in the pre-dawn darkness. Sleep had become elusive, filled with dreams of empty granaries and hollow-eyed children. The village felt smaller each day, as if the cold was physically shrinking their world. But the river, though mostly frozen, still showed patches of flowing water where it curved around large boulders. Steam rose from these open sections, creating small warm pockets in the bitter air. As Gunnar knelt beside one such spot, testing the water temperature with his bare hand, a memory surfaced from deep in his childhood. He could not have been more than 7 years old. His mother, Valdis the Gentle, had taken him to this very spot during another harsh winter, not as severe as this one, but cold enough to make fishing difficult. She had shown him how the thermal springs that fed the river kept certain sections from freezing completely, and how the stones near these warm spots retained heat even in the coldest weather. The earth remembers fire, she had told him in her soft voice. Even in winter it holds warmth from the summer sun. We just need to know how to find it. Valdis had died when Gunnar was 12, taken by a fever that no amount of healing herbs could cure. In the years that followed, as he grew into a warrior, those gentle memories had been buried beneath layers of battle scars and blood-soaked victories. But now, kneeling by the partially frozen river, he could almost hear her voice on the wind. Gunnar began gathering stones from the riverbank, selecting those that felt warmest to the touch. The work was harder than any battle he had ever fought. His fingers, trained to grip sword hilts and warhammer handles, struggled with the delicate task of choosing stones by their texture and weight. Many times he dropped promising rocks back into the water, frustrated by his own clumsiness. But he persisted, filling the leather sack he had brought with stones of various sizes. Some were smooth river rocks, worn round by countless seasons of flowing water. Others were rougher, pulled from the banks where thermal springs had deposited minerals over years of steady warmth. As the sun rose, painting the ice-covered valley in shades of gold and pink, other villagers began to emerge from their homes. Several noticed Gunnar's unusual activity and approached with curiosity. "What are you doing, Bjornbane?" asked Magnus, Olaf's younger son. The young man's face showed the same gaunt look that was becoming common throughout Skelgard as families reduced their food portions. "Gathering stones," Gunnar replied simply, not yet ready to explain his half-formed plan. "For what purpose?" This from Brynja, a middle-aged woman whose husband had died in a fishing accident 2 summers past. She had been managing alone since then, caring for her elderly mother and 2 young daughters. Gunnar hefted his sack of stones, feeling their weight and the residual warmth they still held from the thermal springs. "I remember something my mother once showed me, about stones that hold heat." The small crowd that had gathered exchanged glances. This was not the Gunnar Bjornbane they knew. The feared warrior did not usually spend his mornings collecting rocks like a child gathering pretty shells. Heat for what? Magnus pressed. "For cooking," Gunnar said, the words feeling strange in his mouth. "For baking. For keeping food warm longer, so that smaller portions might feel like larger ones." Brynja's eyes lit with understanding. She had spent years stretching meager resources to feed her family, developing an intuitive grasp of how warmth could make food more satisfying. "You mean to build cooking stones? Like the ones the southern traders sometimes carry?" "Something like that," Gunnar admitted. "Though I am not certain how to proceed." Old Astrid approached, leaning heavily on her walking staff. Her weathered face showed interest rather than skepticism. "Your mother knew the old ways of cooking. Before iron pots became common, before the great hearths, people cooked on stones heated by fire." "It's a good thought, young Bjornbane." Encouraged by her approval, Gunnar spent the morning exploring the areas around the thermal springs. He discovered that certain types of stone held heat longer than others, and that rocks found near the springs often had different colors and textures than those from other areas of the riverbank. As he worked, more villagers came to observe and eventually to help. Eric Ironforge proved particularly useful, his smith's knowledge of how different materials responded to heat, providing insights that Gunnar lacked. "These dark stones here," Eric said, holding up a sample Gunnar had collected. "They're dense, heavy. They'll heat slowly but hold that heat for hours. These lighter ones will heat quickly but cool quickly too. You'll want both types for different purposes." By midday, they had gathered several sacks of promising stones. But Gunnar still faced the larger challenge of turning these raw materials into something useful for cooking. He had watched the village baker's work, had observed his mother preparing meals years ago, but watching and doing were entirely different skills. His first attempt was embarrassingly simple. He built a small fire near his father's hall and placed several stones around the flames. When the stones seemed hot enough, he tried to move them to a flat area where he might cook upon them. The result was a painful lesson in how hot stones could burn even the most calloused hands. Young Sigrid, who had been watching from a respectful distance, stepped forward with a pair of long wooden tongs her father used for managing the goat pen. "Perhaps these might help," she offered quietly. Their eyes met briefly as he accepted the tongs, and Gunnar felt an unfamiliar warmth that had nothing to do with heated stones. Sigrid had always been kind to everyone in the village, but she had never paid particular attention to the fearsome warrior. Now seeing him struggle with tasks that required patience rather than strength, she seemed to regard him with new interest. Using the tongs, Gunnar successfully moved the heated stones to a flat area and attempted to cook a small portion of grain porridge upon them. The results were mixed. Some burned, some remained raw, but it was recognizably food, and it was warm. More importantly, several families who watched the experiment began to see possibilities. If stones could be heated and used for cooking, perhaps food could be prepared more efficiently. Perhaps smaller portions could be made more satisfying through better preparation. As afternoon faded to evening, Gunnar found himself surrounded by women and children eager to understand his stone cooking technique. For the first time in his adult life, people sought his knowledge, not for warfare, but for nurturing. The role felt foreign, but not unwelcome. As he demonstrated how to select stones and how to gauge their temperature, Gunnar discovered that teaching required a different kind of strength than fighting. Patience instead of aggression, gentleness instead of force, encouragement instead of intimidation. That night, as he sat vigil beside his still feverish father, Gunnar reflected on the day's small success. The stone cooking experiment had not solved their food crisis, but it had given the village something precious that had been in short supply: hope. And for Gunnar himself, it had provided something even more valuable. For the first time since childhood, he had spent an entire day creating rather than destroying, building rather than breaking, nurturing rather than conquering. His hands, scarred from 100 battles, still ached from the unfamiliar work of handling cooking stones. But it was a good ache, the kind that came from useful labor rather than violence. Perhaps his mother had been right all those years ago. Perhaps the earth did remember fire, holding warmth even in the darkest winter. Perhaps there were different kinds of strength worth discovering. The discovery of his mother's clay mixing bowl changed everything. Gunnar found it 3 days later while searching through the storage areas beneath the Great Hall, looking for anything that might help with his cooking experiments. The bowl sat in a forgotten corner, wrapped in oiled cloth that had protected it from moisture and time. When he unwrapped it, his breath caught in his throat. The bowl was larger than his cupped hands, made from clay that had been fired to a warm, honey-colored finish. Around its rim, delicate patterns had been carved before firing, spirals and waves that seemed to flow like water even in the flickering torchlight. But it was not the beauty of the piece that stopped him. It was the memory it carried. He could see his mother's hands working within this very bowl, mixing grain and water and herbs into the bread that had fed their family. Could remember the sound of her humming as she worked, the way flour dust caught the morning light streaming through the windows, the warm smell that filled the hall when her bread emerged from the ovens. Valdis the Gentle had been more than just the chieftain's wife. She had been the heart of Skelgard's hospitality, the one who ensured that no visitor left their hall hungry, that no celebration lacked for good food, that even in lean times, meals were prepared with care and love. She made magic with simple ingredients, Gunnar whispered to the empty storage room, cradling the bowl against his chest. Over the following days, the bowl became the center of Gunnar's growing understanding of food preparation. Unlike his clumsy experiments with heated stones, working with the clay vessel felt natural. As if his hands remembered skills they had never formally learned, he began with simple mixtures, ground grain and water, basic porridge that could be stretched to feed more people when prepared with care. But under Astrid the Wise's patient guidance, he learned to add ingredients that made small portions more satisfying. A pinch of dried herbs makes the stomach think it has eaten more, Astrid explained, watching Gunnar work the clay with increasing confidence. Salt awakens the tongue. Even a few drops of honey can transform plain grain into something that brings comfort. The village children, initially afraid of the giant warrior, began to gather around when Gunnar worked with his mother's bowl. They were fascinated by the transformation, watching this man whose hands had wielded death, now coaxing life from simple ingredients. Little Inga, Brynja's youngest daughter, was the first to lose her fear entirely. She approached one morning while Gunnar was mixing a batch of root vegetable porridge, her small face serious with concentration. "My mama says you're learning women's work," she announced with the brutal honesty of the very young. Gunnar paused in his stirring, looking down at the child. "What do you think, little one?" Inga considered this carefully. "I think hungry work is everyone's work." The wisdom of her simple statement struck Gunnar with unexpected force. Here was a child barely old enough to help tend the goats, yet she understood something that had eluded him for 30 years. Survival was not about maintaining rigid roles or preserving masculine pride. It was about doing whatever needed to be done. As word of Gunnar's cooking experiments spread, other villagers began to contribute their own knowledge. Freydis shared her understanding of which wild herbs could still be found even in deep winter, growing in protected spots where thermal springs kept the ground from freezing completely. Magnus and Bjorn, Olaf's sons, proved surprisingly knowledgeable about preparing the small fish that could occasionally be caught in the river's unfrozen sections, but it was Sigrid who became Gunnar's most frequent helper and most patient teacher. She appeared one morning carrying a leather satchel filled with dried berries her family had preserved from autumn's harvest. Without speaking, she began adding them to the porridge Gunnar was preparing, showing him how the fruit's natural sweetness could mask the bitter taste of grain that had been stretched too thin with water. "You don't have to do this," Gunnar told her as they worked side by side. "Help me, I mean." "Your family needs your time." Sigrid looked up from her stirring, her silver hair catching the light from the cooking fire. "My family needs this village to survive. That means we all need you to succeed." Her matter-of-fact response carried no flattery, no attempt to spare his feelings. She saw his efforts as practical necessity, not heroic gesture. Somehow this honest assessment felt more valuable than any praise. Working together, they developed techniques that made their limited food stores stretch further. Bread could be made from a mixture of grain and ground roots, producing loaves that were denser than usual, but far more filling. Soups could be thickened with clay-cooked vegetables until thin broth became substantial stew. Most importantly, they discovered that food prepared with care, mixed in the clay bowl, cooked on properly heated stones, seasoned with whatever herbs they could find, satisfied people in ways that cold, hastily prepared meals never could. Even reduced portions, when served warm and flavorful, helped maintain morale during the darkest part of winter. The physical work of food preparation was teaching Gunnar lessons that no battle had ever provided. His hands, accustomed to the swift, decisive movements of combat, had to learn patience. Clay required gentle handling. Bread dough needed time to rise. Vegetables cooked slowly in their own time and could not be rushed. "Strength is not always about force," Sigrid observed one evening as they cleaned the clay bowl together after preparing a communal meal for several families. "Sometimes it's about knowing when to wait, when to be gentle, when to let things happen as they need to happen." Gunnar studied her face in the firelight, seeing wisdom that had nothing to do with formal education or warrior training. "How did you learn such things?" "From watching," she said simply. "From helping. From understanding that life is more than surviving. It's about how we survive, who we become in the process." That night, as Gunnar sat beside his father's sickbed, He showed Thorwald the clay bowl and described the day's cooking experiments. The old chieftain's fever had broken, but his strength remained limited. Still, his eyes brightened as Gunnar spoke. "Your mother would be proud," Thorwald whispered. "She always said that true leadership was about nourishing people, not just protecting them." "I never understood what she meant," Gunnar admitted. "Neither did I for many years," his father replied. "But watching you these past days, I begin to see. A leader who can only take life cannot build a lasting legacy. But a leader who can nurture life, that man builds something that endures beyond his own days." As Gunnar prepared for sleep that night, he held his mother's bowl in his hands and felt the weight of its history. This simple vessel had fed his family for years before his birth. It nourished generations of Skelgard's people during celebrations and hardships alike. Now it was teaching him that the gentlest strength might also be the most enduring. The first stone oven rose from the earth like hope made manifest. 2 weeks after Gunnar began his cooking experiments, the village faced its darkest hour yet. The morning brought news that young Bjorn, Olaf's elder son, had collapsed while checking the fish traps in the river. Malnutrition was taking its toll, and the reduced rations that had seemed manageable in the beginning were proving insufficient for men doing heavy labor. That afternoon, as Gunnar helped carry the weakened young man back to his family's home, he made a decision that would change everything. "We need more than heated stones," he announced to the gathered crowd outside Olaf's house. "We need a proper oven. Something that can hold heat longer, cook larger quantities, feed more people at once." Eric Ironforge scratched his grizzled beard. "An oven requires more than stones, Bjornbane. It needs careful construction, proper clay, knowledge of how air flows and heat builds." "Then we learn," Gunnar replied simply. The construction began the next morning. Gunnar had chosen a site near the center of the village, close enough to the thermal springs that the ground remained workable despite the freezing air, but positioned where everyone could easily access whatever food was prepared. He started by digging a circular pit, using his powerful arms to break through the top layer of frozen earth until he reached soil that could be shaped and molded. The work was brutally hard. His hands, already scarred from battles and recently cut from handling cooking stones, split and bled in the cold air. But others joined him. Magnus, despite his concern for his brother, picked up a shovel and began digging alongside the giant warrior. Brynja arrived with her 2 daughters, the girls carrying smaller tools to help clear loose dirt from the pit. As the day progressed, more villagers appeared. Old Hakon brought his knowledge of clay deposits near the thermal springs. Vridis contributed her understanding of how different materials responded to fire and heat. Even Astrid the Wise, leaning heavily on her walking staff, offered guidance based on stories her grandmother had told of ancient cooking methods. The work was slow, complicated by the cold, and by their collective inexperience. None of them had built a stone oven before, but they approached the task with the methodical patience that northern people learned from surviving countless harsh winters. Gunnar found himself at the center of the effort, not as commander, but as coordinator. Instead of barking orders, as he might have done leading a raid, he listened to suggestions, asked questions, deferred to expertise that others possessed. When Eric recommended a particular type of stone for the oven's base, Gunnar accepted the advice without argument. When Sigrid suggested modifications to the pit's shape based on her experience with cooking fires, he incorporated her ideas immediately. The physical construction required different skills than any Gunnar had previously developed. The stones had to be fitted together with precision, leaving gaps for airflow while ensuring structural stability. The clay mortar needed to be mixed to exactly the right consistency. Too wet, and it would not hold. Too dry, and it would crack in the heat. His massive hands, accustomed to gripping weapons, struggled with the delicate work of shaping clay and positioning stones. More than once, his forceful approach caused carefully placed stones to shift out of alignment, requiring patient reconstruction. "Gently," Sigrid murmured during one such moment, placing her smaller hands over his to guide the placement of a critical stone. "Let the materials work with you, not against you." Her touch sent an unexpected warmth through him that had nothing to do with the heated stones they were working with. When their eyes met over the growing oven structure, Gunnar felt something shift inside his chest. Not the battle fury he knew so well, but something quieter and more profound. By the third day, the basic structure was complete. The oven was crude compared to the sophisticated cooking facilities in larger settlements, but it was functional. More importantly, it represented something unprecedented in Skelgard, a project that had brought the entire community together in shared labor toward a common goal. The first test came that evening. Gunnar built a fire inside the oven chamber, feeding it carefully until the stones glowed with heat. When the fire had burned down to coals, he scraped them out and placed the first batch of bread inside the heated chamber. The entire village gathered to watch, their faces reflecting both hope and anxiety. If the oven worked, it could transform their approach to food preparation. If it failed, they would have wasted precious time and energy that could have been spent on other survival efforts. As the bread baked, the oven filled the evening air with an aroma that had been absent from Skelgard for weeks. Not just the smell of food, but the warm, comforting scent of bread rising and browning, of proper cooking taking place. When Gunnar finally opened the oven and withdrew the loaves, a cheer went up from the assembled villagers. The bread was slightly uneven, darker in some places than others, but it was recognizably bread, and it was still warm. More importantly, the oven had retained enough heat to bake multiple batches. Throughout the evening, families brought their own ingredients to be cooked in the shared facility. Root vegetables, preserved fish, even experimental combinations of grain and wild plants that would have been inedible if served cold became palatable when properly baked. The communal aspect of the oven proved as valuable as its practical function. Instead of families eating alone in their cold homes, people gathered around the warm structure to share their meals. Conversations resumed. Stories were told. Children played games, while adults discussed plans for surviving the remainder of winter. For the first time since the sea had frozen, Skelgard felt like a community rather than a collection of frightened individuals. That night, as Gunnar cleaned clay from his hands and tended the coals that would keep the oven site warm until morning, his father appeared beside him. Thorwald the Grey had regained enough strength to walk short distances, though he still tired easily. "You have built more than an oven," the old chieftain observed, watching villagers reluctantly return to their homes after hours of gathered warmth and companionship. "It is just stones and clay," Gunnar replied, though he knew his father was referring to something deeper. "No," Thorwald said quietly. "You have built hope. You have shown our people that survival is not just about enduring hardship, but about finding ways to live with dignity and joy even in the darkest times." As Gunnar banked the coals and prepared to return to the great hall, he reflected on the truth of his father's words. The oven was indeed more than stones and clay. It was proof that problems could be solved through cooperation rather than conquest, that strength could be expressed through building rather than breaking. Most importantly, it was evidence that even in the depths of winter's cruelest trial, there remained reasons to believe in spring's eventual return. The recipe stones began as necessity and became legacy. In the weeks following the first oven's success, Gunnar discovered that feeding an entire village required more than just heat and good intentions. Different families had different needs, different ingredients, different knowledge passed down through generations. What worked for one household might prove disastrous for another. The problem became clear when old Ragnhild, whose family had lived in Skelgard for 5 generations, brought a mixture of roots and grain to the communal oven. The combination should have produced edible bread, but instead created something that crumbled to dust when touched. The old woman stood beside the ruined loaves with tears in her eyes, not just for the wasted food, but for the lost knowledge. "My grandmother could make bread from anything," she whispered. "Roots, bark, even dried kelp in the hungriest times. But I never learned the proportions, never memorized the recipes. Always thought there would be time. That evening, Gunnar sat in the great hall with a collection of flat stones spread before him on the oak table. Using a sharp knife, he began carving symbols into their surfaces, simple marks that could represent different ingredients, measurements, cooking times. The work was painstaking. His large hands, still learning precision, struggled with the delicate carving. Several stones cracked under too much pressure. Others ended up with marks too crude to be easily understood. But gradually a system emerged, a circle for grain, wavy lines for water, dots for dried berries, straight lines to indicate quantities, one line for a small amount, 3 lines for larger portions, curved marks to show cooking time. The deeper the curve, the longer the heating required. Astrid the Wise was the first to understand what Gunnar was attempting. When she saw him working by firelight, carving careful symbols into stone, her weathered face lit with comprehension. "You are making knowledge permanent," she said, settling beside him with her own collection of memories, recording what our grandmothers knew, so it cannot be lost again. Together, they worked through the night, Astrid sharing recipes while Gunnar carved them into stone. Each successful combination that families had discovered was recorded. Each cooking technique that had proved effective was marked in permanent symbols. The stones became the village's collective cookbook, but more than that, they became a repository of wisdom that could survive any future crisis. As word spread of the recipe stones, other villagers began contributing their own knowledge. Eric Ironforge knew techniques for cooking with very little fuel, learned during long expeditions to trade metals. Traders understood which wild plants could safely supplement grain when food ran low. Even young Magnus, despite his recent weakness, remembered methods his mother had used for preserving fish that could be adapted to their current situation. The process of recording these recipes brought unexpected benefits. As families shared their knowledge, they learned from each other. Cooking techniques that had been jealously guarded secrets for generations became common property. The result was a dramatic improvement in both the quantity and quality of food the village could produce from their dwindling stores. More importantly, the recipe stones created a new form of evening entertainment. Instead of huddling in cold homes, families gathered around the communal oven to share meals and stories. Children learned to read the symbols, turning practical knowledge into a form of education. Adults discovered recipes they had never known existed within their own community. Gunnar found himself at the center of these gatherings, not as a warrior to be feared, but as a keeper of knowledge to be consulted. When disputes arose about proper cooking methods, people looked to him for guidance. When experiments failed, they sought his advice for improvement. The role felt strange but increasingly natural. Instead of solving problems through force, he was solving them through patience and accumulated wisdom. Instead of inspiring fear, he was inspiring confidence. Instead of taking from enemies, he was giving to friends. His relationship with Sigrid deepened during these evening gatherings. She proved exceptionally skilled at reading the stone symbols, and often helped translate the carved recipes for families who struggled with the markings. Her gentle manner with the elderly and patient teaching of children complemented Gunnar's more direct approach. One evening, as they worked together to help little Inga understand how to interpret the symbols for root cake preparation, Sigrid spoke quietly. "You have changed," she observed, watching Gunnar guide the child's finger along the carved lines. "Not just what you do, but who you are." Gunnar paused in his explanation to Inga, considering Sigrid's words. "I am still the same man." "No," she said gently. "The same man would have tried to solve this crisis by raiding other villages, by taking what others had gathered. This man builds ovens and teaches children to read recipes carved in stone." That night, Gunnar sat alone in the great hall, surrounded by completed recipe stones and new ones waiting to be carved. His father slept peacefully nearby, finally recovered enough to spend full days out of bed. Though still weaker than before the crisis began, the war hammer that had once defined Gunnar's identity hung on the wall, untouched for weeks. Dust had gathered on its massive head. The leather wrapping on its handle had begun to crack from disuse. It had become a relic of a different life, a museum piece representing a man he had been, but was no longer. In its place, Gunnar's most precious possessions had become his mother's clay bowl, the cooking stones he had gathered from the thermal springs, and the growing collection of recipe stones that preserved his community's accumulated wisdom. The transformation was not complete. Gunnar still felt the old instincts when challenges arose, still heard the voice in his head that suggested violence as the quickest solution to problems. But that voice grew quieter each day, replaced by new instincts that valued patience over aggression, building over breaking, nurturing over conquering. As he carved symbols into a new stone, recording Fridas's technique for making healing broth from bitter roots, Gunnar reflected on the strange path his life had taken. 6 months ago, he had been known throughout the northern settlements as a destroyer of enemies. Now he was becoming known throughout Skelgard as a creator of sustenance. The recipe stones would outlast any individual life, preserving knowledge for future generations who might face similar challenges. In carving them, Gunnar was not just solving an immediate crisis. He was building a legacy that had nothing to do with conquest or glory, and everything to do with care and community. For the first time in his adult life, that felt like enough. The black banner appeared on the ridge like a raven against the snow. It was Magnus who spotted it first, despite his recent weakness from malnutrition. The young man had been checking the river traps in the early morning when movement on the northern ridge caught his eye. By the time he stumbled back to the village, his face was grey with more than cold. "Raiders!" he gasped, collapsing against the communal oven where Gunnar was preparing the morning bread. Armed men on the ridge, maybe 30, maybe more, flying Eric Bloodaxe's banner. The words hit Gunnar like a physical blow. Eric Bloodaxe, his former shield brother, his closest friend through 5 years of raids and battles, the man who had stood beside him when they faced the great brown bear in the mountains. Eric, who had left Skelgard 3 summers ago after a dispute with Thorwald the Grey over raiding tactics. More than that, Eric was the one person who truly understood Gunnar's capabilities as a warrior. He knew every strategy Gunnar might employ, every weakness that might be exploited. If Eric had come to Skelgard with raiders during their time of vulnerability, it was not coincidence. Word spread through the village with the speed of wildfire. Families abandoned their morning tasks to cluster around the communal oven, seeking both warmth and the comfort of being together. The children who had recently learned to laugh again fell silent. The elderly who had begun to believe they might survive the winter now faced a different kind of death. Astrid the Wise climbed slowly to the top of her house, using her aged eyes to scan the ridgeline. When she descended, her expression confirmed everyone's fears. "They are watching us," she reported. "Not attacking, not moving, just watching, waiting." Eric Ironforge's face was grim as he considered their situation. "They know we are weakened, know we have little food, little strength for fighting. They are waiting for us to weaken further, or for desperation to make us foolish." Gunnar felt the familiar battle hunger stirring in his chest, the old instinct to grab his warhammer, gather what fighting men remained strong enough to wield weapons, and meet this threat with violence. It would be a glorious death, the kind of ending that would earn songs and stories. It would also be futile. "How many men do we have fit for battle?" he asked Eric, though he already knew the answer would be inadequate. "Maybe 15 who can hold weapons effectively," Eric replied. "Half that many who could fight for more than a few minutes without collapsing." Against 30 raiders, led by someone who knew all of Gunnar's tactics, 15 weakened men would last perhaps as long as snow in a forge fire. Thorwald the Grey emerged from the great hall, moving slowly but with dignity. Despite his recent illness, the old chieftain's presence still commanded respect. The gathered villagers turned to him expectantly, hoping for wisdom or strategy that might save them. "I know why Eric has come," Thorwald said quietly. "He believes we are finished, believes this winter has broken us beyond recovery. He means to take what little we have left before we die anyway." Then we fight, said young Bjorn, Olaf's son, trying to stand straighter despite his obvious weakness. We die as free people, not as victims. Several other men murmured agreement, the old warrior code asserting itself even in desperate circumstances. Better death with honor than survival through submission. But Gunnar found himself thinking not of glorious death, but of the recipe stones sitting in the great hall, of the ovens that had brought his people together around shared meals, of the knowledge they had preserved and the community they had built during the darkest winter in memory. There is another way, he said slowly, the idea forming even as he spoke. The gathered villagers turned to him with expressions ranging from hope to skepticism. Gunnar felt the weight of their attention, the burden of leadership that his father had carried for so many years. We invite them to share our food. The silence that followed his words was so complete that the crackling of the oven fire sounded like thunder. Several men stared at him as if he had lost his mind. Others looked confused, uncertain they had heard correctly. You would surrender? Brynja asked, her voice tight with fear for her daughters. Not surrender, Gunnar replied, his voice gaining strength as the plan took shape in his mind. We show them that there is more strength in sharing than in taking, more wisdom in cooperation than in conquest. Eric Ironforge shook his head vigorously. Bjornbane, these are raiders, men who live by taking from others. You cannot reason with wolves. Eric Bloodaxe is not a wolf, Gunnar countered. He is a man I knew well, a man who chose raiding because he believed it was the only way to ensure his people's survival. But what if we could show him a different way? Astrid the Wise studied Gunnar's face with eyes that had seen 70 winters. You would risk everything on the chance that your former friend might choose peace over plunder. I would risk everything on the chance that hunger and cold affect all people the same way, Gunnar replied. Eric's men are not demons. They are human beings, facing the same winter we are, driven by the same fears, motivated by the same desire to see their families survive. Sigrid stepped forward, her silver hair catching the morning light. You mean to cook for them? To treat enemies as guests? I mean to treat desperate people as desperate people, Gunnar said. To offer what we have discovered, that survival is not about taking from others, but about finding ways to make what we have stretch further. The debate that followed was intense but brief. Some villagers supported Gunnar's plan, moved by the transformation they had witnessed in their giant protector. Others argued for traditional resistance, preferring death in battle to the uncertainty of trusting enemies. In the end, it was Thorwald the Grey who settled the matter. The old chieftain raised his hand for silence, and when he spoke, his voice carried the authority of 3 decades of leadership. My son has changed much during this winter, he said. He has learned that true strength is not about what you can destroy, but about what you can build. If he believes this approach might save our people, I will support him. The decision made, preparations began immediately. Every family contributed what food they could spare to create the largest feast possible with their remaining stores. The communal ovens were fired to maximum heat. Recipe stones were consulted to determine the most efficient use of ingredients. As Gunnar worked alongside his neighbors to prepare what might be either a celebration of peace or their final meal, he felt the weight of enormous risk. If his plan failed, if Eric proved unwilling to listen to reason, they would have exhausted their food stores and weakened themselves further for the battle that would inevitably follow. But as he watched families working together, sharing knowledge and resources without thought of personal advantage, Gunnar felt something stronger than fear. He felt conviction. The winter had taught them all a lesson about survival. Not the harsh lesson of taking what others had, but the gentler lesson of making more from less through cooperation and care. Now it was time to discover whether that lesson could extend beyond the boundaries of their own community, whether the strength they had found in sharing might be powerful enough to transform enemies into allies. The black banner still flew on the ridge, but Gunnar no longer saw it as a symbol of doom. He saw it as an opportunity to prove that there were different kinds of victory worth pursuing. The great feast cauldron had never held so much hope and terror at once. Gunnar had found the massive iron vessel in the deepest storage chamber beneath the great hall, a relic from celebrations of more prosperous times. It was large enough to feed 100 people, but it had not been used in years. When he and Eric Ironforge hauled it up into the daylight, its surface was dark with disuse, and its bottom showed spots of rust. But it was sound, and it was exactly what Gunnar needed for the most dangerous gamble of his life. The cauldron represented more than just cooking. Equipment. It was the centerpiece of his plan to offer hospitality to an army of raiders who had come to destroy them. As Eric Ironforge worked to clean and repair the vessel, his hands moved with the careful precision of a man preparing for either triumph or doom. "You understand what you are asking," Eric said as he scoured rust from the cauldron's interior. "If your plan fails, we will have used the last of our food stores to feed our killers before they finish us." Gunnar nodded, feeling the weight of that truth. "And if our plan succeeds, we will have turned enemies into allies without shedding blood. Those are long odds, Bjornbane. Perhaps. But better long odds on survival than certain death in battle." The preparation consumed the entire day. Every family in Skelgard contributed something to the feast: preserved fish, root vegetables, grain, dried berries, herbs, even small amounts of honey that had been saved for the most desperate times. The quantity seemed pitifully small when gathered together, but Gunnar had learned much about making food stretch during the long winter months, using the recipe stones as guides. He directed the preparation of dishes that would provide maximum nutrition and satisfaction from minimum ingredients. Thick stews that would warm cold bodies, dense breads that would fill empty stomachs, herbal teas that would comfort troubled minds. The work required every cooking technique they had developed, every lesson learned during their months of careful rationing. Multiple ovens burned simultaneously. The great cauldron bubbled over a fire that required constant tending. Smaller pots and pans contributed side dishes that would round out the meal, but the physical preparation was only part of the challenge. The emotional preparation proved equally demanding. Many villagers struggled with the concept of welcoming armed enemies into their midst. Brynja pulled Gunnar aside while he was stirring the great cauldron, her face tight with maternal fear. "My daughters," she said quietly, "if these men prove treacherous, what protection will our children have?" Gunnar understood her concern. In normal circumstances, he would have shared it. Raiders were not known for their gentle treatment of conquered populations, particularly the vulnerable. "The same protection they have always had," he replied. "Our determination to defend them. But instead of defending with sword and shield, we defend with bread and broth, and if that fails—" Gunnar paused in his stirring, meeting her eyes with steady resolve. "Then we will have tried something worth trying. And our children will know that we exhausted every possibility before resorting to violence." Similar conversations took place throughout the village as families grappled with the unprecedented nature of their situation. Some found comfort in Gunnar's quiet confidence. Others remained skeptical, but willing to trust in his judgment. A few quietly sharpened weapons and hid them within easy reach, preparing for the worst while hoping for the best. As afternoon faded toward evening, scouts reported movement on the ridge. The raiders were preparing to descend, though their intentions remained unclear. They could be planning an attack, or they could be responding to the messages Gunnar had sent, formal invitations to join Skelgard for an evening meal. The messages themselves had been a diplomatic challenge. How do you invite armed enemies to dinner without appearing weak or desperate? How do you convey strength while offering peace? Gunnar had settled on simple honesty. "Eric Bloodaxe, my former shield brother, winter has tested us all. We have learned that survival comes not from taking what others have, but from sharing what we can make together. If you and your men are hungry and cold, we invite you to join us for a warm meal and warm conversation. There is enough for all." Whether Eric would accept such an invitation remained unknown. Whether he would honor it if he did accept was even more uncertain. As darkness approached, The village transformed itself into something unprecedented, a battlefield prepared for hospitality instead of hostility. The communal ovens glowed like beacons in the gathering dusk. The great cauldron sent fragrant steam into the cold air. Tables made from planks and sawhorses were arranged in a large circle around the cooking area. With space for far more people than Skelgard's population, Gunnar found himself standing in the center of it all, ladle in hand instead of warhammer, feeling more nervous than he had before any battle. In combat, he had always known his role, understood his capabilities, trusted in his training and experience. This situation offered no such certainties. Sigrid appeared beside him, carrying wooden bowls and cups that would be needed for serving. Her presence brought a calmness that he had not realized he was missing. "You are afraid," she observed, not as criticism, but as simple fact. "Terrified," Gunnar admitted. "In battle, I knew what to expect. Win or lose, live or die, the possibilities were clear. This is uncharted territory. That is what makes it brave," Sigrid replied. "Anyone can fight when fighting is the only option. It takes true courage to choose peace when war would be easier." Their conversation was interrupted by shouts from the village perimeter. Torches appeared on the paths leading down from the ridge. The raiders were coming. Gunnar felt his pulse quicken, not with battle fury, but with a different kind of intensity. Everything he had learned during the winter, everything he had become, every new understanding about strength and leadership and the true meaning of protection, would be tested in the next few hours. As the torches drew closer, details became visible. Armed men in mail and furs, weapons gleaming in the firelight, faces hidden beneath helmets and wrapped scarves. At their head walked a familiar figure, Eric Bloodaxe, tall and broad-shouldered, moving with the confident stride of a man accustomed to taking what he wanted. The villagers of Skelgard stood around their feast preparations, unarmed but not defenseless. Their defense was the food they had prepared, the warmth they offered, the unprecedented choice to meet potential enemies with hospitality instead of hostility. Gunnar moved to the front of the group, still holding his ladle, still wearing the simple clothing of a cook rather than the mail and furs of a warrior. Behind him, the great cauldron bubbled and steamed, filling the air with aromas that spoke of comfort and sustenance. The two groups approached each other across the snow-covered ground, raiders expecting battle, villagers offering bread. Between them lay not just physical distance, but a gap between two completely different ways of understanding strength, survival, and what it meant to be human in a harsh world. As Eric Bloodaxe stepped into the circle of firelight cast by the cooking fires, his eyes met Gunnar's across that divide. For a moment, time seemed suspended, waiting to see which vision of the world would prove stronger, the vision that taught men to take what they needed through force and fear, or the vision that taught them to share what they had through trust and hope. Everything Gunnar had learned, everything he had become, everything he believed about the possibility of human kindness in desperate times, came down to this single moment, the moment when enemies would choose whether to remain enemies or discover that they had never really been enemies at all. Eric Bloodaxe stood at the edge of the firelight, like a wolf uncertain whether he faced prey or predator. His sword belt hung heavy with weapons, the curved blade that had taken dozens of lives, the war axe that had earned him his fearsome name, the long knife that could open a man's throat before he knew death was coming. These tools of violence seemed almost to glow in the dancing, shadows cast by Skelgard's cooking, fires, but the scene before him clearly confounded every expectation. He had brought to this raid, instead of cowering villagers or desperate warriors preparing for hopeless battle, Eric found himself facing something unprecedented, an entire community gathered around tables laden with food, cooking fires burning bright against the winter darkness, the rich aromas of properly prepared meals filling the frigid air. At the center of it all stood Gunnar Bjornbane, but not the Gunnar that Eric remembered. This man held a ladle instead of a warhammer. His hands showed burns and cuts from cooking rather than scars from combat. Most unsettling of all, his eyes held no trace of the battle fury that had made him legendary among northern warriors. "Brother," Gunnar said quietly, using the old term of friendship from their raiding days together, "you and your men look cold and hungry. Will you join us?" Eric's warriors shifted restlessly behind him, hands on weapon hilts, clearly confused by this reception. They had prepared for battle or easy conquest, not for dinner invitations. Several of them looked to their leader for guidance on how to respond to such unprecedented hospitality. Eric himself struggled with the same confusion. His entire adult life had been built around the simple mathematics of strength. Take from the weak, fight the strong, survive through superior force. The scene before him challenged those fundamental assumptions. "This is some trick," he said finally, his voice carrying the rough edge of a man who trusted nothing he could not understand. "You seek to lower our guard, make us vulnerable to ambush." Gunnar stepped closer, moving slowly and keeping his hands visible. Around him, the villagers of Skelgard remained calm, continuing to tend their cooking fires and arrange food on the wooden tables. Children played nearby, their laughter a strange counterpoint to the tension between the armed groups. "Look around, Eric," Gunnar said. "Where are the hidden archers? Where are the trap pits? Where are the warriors waiting in ambush?" He gestured toward the villagers. "These are farmers and fishermen, craftsmen and grandmothers, half-starved from winter's hardship, but still willing to share what they have." One of Eric's men, a young raider with hungry eyes, took an involuntary step toward the nearest table where fresh bread was cooling. The smell of properly baked food was clearly affecting warriors who had spent weeks surviving on cold rations and whatever game they could catch in the frozen wilderness. "We came to take your stores," Eric said bluntly. "To gather what remained before winter finished you entirely. These lands cannot support two communities through such a harsh season." "You are right," Gunnar agreed, surprising his former shield brother with the admission. "These lands cannot support two separate communities, but they might support one larger community if we pooled our knowledge and resources instead of fighting over scraps." The suggestion hung in the air like smoke from the cooking fires. Eric stared at Gunnar as if seeing him clearly for the first time, trying to reconcile this man with the fierce warrior he had once known. "You have changed," Eric said slowly. "The Gunnar Bjornbane I knew would have met us with steel, not soup. The Gunnar Bjornbane you knew believed that strength meant taking from others," Gunnar replied. "This winter taught me that true strength means creating abundance from scarcity, building community from isolation, finding ways for everyone to survive instead of ensuring that only the strongest do." Behind Eric, his men were clearly wavering. The cold night air carried the sense of properly seasoned food, of warm bread and rich stew. Several warriors had removed their helmets, revealing faces gaunt with hunger and eyes hollow from weeks of inadequate nutrition. "It smells like my mother's cooking," one young raider whispered to his companion, apparently unaware that his words carried clearly in the still air. Eric heard the comment and recognized the danger it represented. Hungry men were vulnerable to temptation. Homesick warriors might choose comfort over conquest. If his raiders began to see Skelgard's villagers as potential hosts rather than victims, his entire campaign would collapse. "This is weakness," he declared loudly, addressing both his own men and Gunnar's villagers. "Survival requires taking what you need from those too weak to protect it. That is the natural order. The strong survive, the weak perish. And what happens when the strong run out of weak people to prey upon?" Gunnar asked quietly. "When winter kills the raiders as surely as it kills their victims. When everyone is too busy taking from each other to create anything worth having." The question struck at something fundamental in Eric's worldview. His entire leadership depended on the assumption that there would always be someone weaker to exploit, always be communities that could be raided for supplies. But this winter had been different. Settlement after settlement had proven too poor to raid profitably. Families had abandoned their homes rather than face starvation. The easy targets were gone, leaving only choices between desperate communities fighting over diminishing resources. The conversation was interrupted by a commotion among Eric's men. One of the younger raiders had apparently been overcome by the smell of food and had taken several steps toward the nearest table. His companions were pulling him back, but not without visible reluctance. In that moment of distraction, something fundamental shifted in the balance between the two groups. The artificial separation between raiders and villagers began to blur as human needs asserted themselves over tribal loyalties. The breakthrough came when Sigrid stepped forward carrying a simple loaf of bread. She moved with quiet confidence between the two groups of armed men, her silver hair catching the firelight, her expression serene despite the tension crackling in the winter air. In her hands, she carried one of the loaves that had just emerged from the stone ovens, dark-crusted, still warm, releasing wisps of steam into the cold night. Without speaking, she broke the bread in half and offered one piece to Eric Bloodaxe. The gesture was so unexpected, so contrary to every protocol of warfare and diplomacy, that conversation stopped entirely. Raiders and villagers alike watched in stunned silence as this unarmed woman extended food toward a man whose reputation for violence stretched across the northern settlements. Eric stared at the offered bread as if it might be poisoned or cursed. His hand moved instinctively toward his sword hilt, then stopped. The simple humanity of the gesture seemed to short-circuit his capacity for suspicion. "Why?" he asked, his voice rougher than usual. "Because you are hungry?" Sigrid replied simply. "Because all people deserve to eat when food is available. Because sharing bread is how we recognize each other as human." The shared bread loaf, for that was how the moment would be remembered in Skelgard's stories, represented everything. Gunnar had learned about strength during the long winter. Not the strength to take from others, but the strength to give when giving seemed impossible. Not the strength to destroy enemies, but the strength to recognize that enemies were often just hungry, frightened people making desperate choices. Eric looked from the bread to Sigrid's face, then to Gunnar standing nearby, then to his own men who were watching with expressions ranging from confusion to hope to barely controlled hunger. Slowly, as if the movement required enormous effort, Eric reached out and accepted the offered bread. The moment his fingers touched the warm crust, something fundamental changed in the dynamic between the two groups. The rigid separation between raiders and villagers began to dissolve, replaced by the simple acknowledgement of shared human need. Eric raised the bread to his mouth and took a bite. His eyes closed as he chewed, and for just a moment, the hardened raider disappeared, replaced by a man who had not tasted properly baked bread in weeks. When he opened his eyes, they were bright with unshed tears. "It tastes like home," he whispered. That simple admission opened floodgates. The young raider who had been pulled back from the food tables stepped forward again, and this time his companions did not stop him. An elderly villager handed him a bowl of stew, which he accepted with trembling hands. More raiders began to approach the tables, drawn by hunger and the increasingly obvious sincerity of Skelgard's hospitality. They moved hesitantly at first, still wearing their weapons, still maintaining the posture of potential enemies. But as they were welcomed with food and warmth rather than suspicion and fear, their defensive barriers began to crumble. Gunnar watched the transformation with something approaching wonder. Around the cooking fires, men who had come prepared for violence were sharing meals with families they had intended to rob. Children who should have been terrified of armed strangers were offering cups of warm tea to raiders whose hands still bore the calluses of recent sword work. Eric Bloodaxe found himself seated beside Astrid the Wise, accepting a second helping of root stew, while the old woman told stories of previous harsh winters and how communities had survived them through cooperation rather than conquest. "We tried raiding," Eric admitted between bites, speaking directly to Gunnar for the first time since accepting Sigrid's bread. "Hit 3 settlements south of here. Found nothing worth taking. Everyone was as desperate as we were. The winter affected all of us," Gunnar replied. "But we discovered that desperation could drive us toward each other instead of against each other." As the evening progressed, The artificial divisions between the two groups continued to break down. Eric's warriors shared stories of their own hungry families waiting in temporary camps, of children who had not seen fresh bread in months, of elderly parents who might not survive until spring without better nutrition. The villagers of Skelgard responded with practical advice rather than pity. They shared their recipe stones, explaining how small amounts of food could be stretched to feed more people. They demonstrated cooking techniques that could extract maximum nutrition from minimal ingredients. They offered surplus supplies, not as tribute to prevent attack, but as gifts between communities facing the same challenges. Most significantly, they extended an invitation that would have been unthinkable just hours earlier. "Stay," Thorwald the Grey said, as the formal feast wound down and people began preparing for sleep. "Bring your families. Combine our resources and knowledge. Survive this winter together instead of separately." Eric looked around at his men, seeing in their faces the same war between old instincts and new possibilities that he felt in his own heart. The Raiders' Code demanded that he take what he could and move on, seeking the next opportunity for profitable violence, but the bread he had shared, the warmth he had experienced, the genuine kindness he had encountered, suggested a different path forward, a path that led away from the endless cycle of taking and being taken from, toward something unprecedented in his experience, a community based on mutual support rather than mutual exploitation. The choice would define not just his own fate, but the fate of two communities and everyone who depended on them for survival. Spring arrived in Skelgard Valley like a promise kept. The ice that had held the sea captive for 4 long months began to crack with sounds like distant thunder. Streams of meltwater carved new channels through the snow, carrying the music of renewal down from the mountain peaks. The air itself seemed to warm with possibility as families emerged, from homes where they had weathered the harshest winter in living memory, but the greatest transformation was not in the landscape, it was in the people themselves, where once there had been two separate communities struggling against each other for survival. Now there was one larger community that had discovered strength through unity. Eric Bloodaxe's raiders had become permanent residents of Skelgard Valley, bringing their families from temporary camps to settle alongside neighbors who had once been intended victims. The merger had not been without challenges. Different customs had to be negotiated. Resources had to be redistributed. Leadership roles had to be redefined to accommodate the needs of a much larger population. But the foundation of shared meals and mutual support that had been established during that pivotal winter night had proven strong enough to support continued cooperation. At the heart of it all stood the memorial stone circle, a monument built around the original communal ovens to honor the lessons learned during the winter of transformation Gunnar had proposed. The memorial during the spring planning meetings, but its construction had become a community effort involving everyone who had lived through those dark months. Each family contributed stones to the circle, many carved with symbols representing their own experiences of hardship and hope. The recipe stones had been incorporated into the memorial, creating a permanent library of cooking knowledge that would be available to future generations. But additional stones had been added, stones carved with symbols representing cooperation, hospitality, the courage to choose peace over violence, the wisdom to recognize that true strength lay in caring for others. The circle was not just a monument to survival, but a testament to transformation. It represented the community's commitment to remember not just what they had endured, but what they had learned about human nature and the possibilities for building something better than mere survival. On the spring morning when the memorial was formally dedicated, Gunnar stood in its center and reflected on how profoundly his own life had changed. The war hammer that had once defined his identity remained in the great hall, but it had become a museum piece, a reminder of who he had been rather than who he was becoming. His hands, once tools of destruction, now bore the permanent marks of creation, burned scars from cooking fires, cuts from stone carving, calluses from kneading bread and stirring stew. These were honorable scars, earned through service to his community rather than conquest of enemies. The ceremony was simple but meaningful. Thorwald the Grey, though still frail from his winter illness, spoke words that captured the transformation they had all experienced. We gathered stones to build ovens for warmth and sustenance. We found that in building together, we built more than cooking fires. We built trust. We built community. We built hope that endured beyond the darkest winter any of us had known. Eric Bloodaxe, now serving as Gunnar's partner in community leadership, added his own reflection. I came to this valley seeking to take what others had gathered through their labor. I found instead that what they had gathered was not grain or gold, but wisdom. The wisdom to know that sharing makes everyone stronger, that cooperation creates abundance where competition creates only scarcity. But it was Sigrid who spoke the words that brought tears to many eyes. This memorial honors not just those who survived, but those who chose how to survive, who chose to remain human in circumstances that might have made them into something else, who proved that even in the darkest times, kindness is not weakness, but the greatest strength of all. As the dedication ceremony concluded, children who had learned to read the recipe stones during the winter months gathered around the memorial to trace the carved symbols with their fingers. They were learning more than cooking techniques. They were learning the stories of how their community had been transformed through patience, generosity, and the courage to trust in human goodness. Later that day, Gunnar and Sigrid walked together to the shoreline, where the sea was finally beginning to show patches of open water. Fishing boats that had sat unused for months were being prepared for their return to the waves. The abundance that winter had stolen would gradually return, but the abundance they had discovered in human connection would endure regardless of seasons. "Do you ever regret it?" Sigrid asked as they watched ice floes drift slowly toward the horizon. Giving up the warrior's life for this? Gunnar considered the question seriously. The life he had lived before the winter seemed like a distant memory now. Glorious, perhaps, but ultimately empty. All those victories, all that plunder, all that fearsome reputation had contributed nothing lasting to the world. The warrior's life was about taking, he said finally. This life is about giving. I have learned that what you give away multiplies, while what you take away diminishes. I am a wealthier man now, though I own far less than I once did. That evening, as families gathered for the communal meal that had become Skelgard's most cherished tradition, Gunnar took his accustomed place not at the head table, but at the cooking fires, where he could serve others before serving himself. The great cauldron bubbled with the first soup, made from fresh fish caught in the newly opened waters. Children played games around the memorial stone circle. Adults shared stories and planned for the planting season ahead, as Gunnar ladled soup into wooden bowls and handed them to neighbors who had once been strangers or enemies. He felt a deep satisfaction that no battlefield victory had ever provided. This was legacy worth building, not monuments to conquest, but traditions of care, not stories of what he had taken from the world, but evidence of what he had contributed to it. The trial had been to outlast the winter, but the victory had been learning that survival was not about outlasting anything. It was about building something worth surviving for, and in the warmth of shared meals and shared purpose, in the laughter of children who would grow up knowing that cooperation was stronger than conflict, in the simple daily acts of caring for others as much as caring for oneself. Gunnar had found a victory that would endure far beyond any winter, however harsh.